kitchen was dim, the late afternoon sun spilling through the window in thin golden slats that barely warmed the cold coffee, trembling in my hand. I sat at the scratched oak table we'd bought second-hand from a thrift shop in Red Hook years, ergo back when we were still dreaming big on a shoestring budget. Outside, the New York street buzzed below, cars honking impatiently, lights flickering on as dusk crept over the city like a heavy curtain. But inside, I was sinking deeper than I'd ever sunk before. A slow drown in a sea of doubt and silence. My name's Ethan Harper, and for 15 years I thought I had it all. A solid job crunching numbers at a midtown accounting firm, a brownstone in Carroll Gardens we'd paid off early with every spare dime we could scrape together, and a wife, Sarah, who I'd loved since we were broke kids sharing a roach-infested studio in Brooklyn. People looked at us and saw the perfect couple, her sharp wit cutting through a room like a blade, my quiet stability holding us steady through every storm. Friends envied us. Strangers smiled at us on the subway when we'd lean into each other, laughing over nothing, and I believed it too. Believed we were untouchable, a team against the world. But lately that picture had started to crack, edges fraying like an old photograph left too long in the sun, and tonight it didn't just crack, it shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces I couldn't piece back together, no matter how hard I tried. Sarah had been drifting away for months, maybe longer if I stopped lying to myself about the signs I'd ignored. Late nights at the office stretched into mornings, where she'd stumble in bleary-eyed our Friday date nights. Once sacred, a ritual of pizza and wine in our tiny kitchen, dwindled to nothing, replaced by vague texts about work emergencies. Conversations that used to flow like water, easy and warm, dried up before they could even start, leaving us sitting across from each other in silence, strangers in our own home. It was like an invisible wall had grown between us, brick by silent. Brick, each one laid with every excuse she tossed my way, each one a little flimsier than the last. I'm not a talker. I've always been the guy who buries himself in spreadsheets, letting the numbers sort out the chaos of life, their clean logic a refuge from the mess of emotions I never knew how to handle. They don't lie, don't twist, don't leave you guessing in the dark. But even I couldn't ignore the signs piling up like unpaid bills on the counter, her phone buzzing at odd hours, her quick glances away when I asked about her day, the way she'd stopped touching me, stopped seeing me. She'd breeze in after midnight, brushing past me like I was part of the furniture. A worn-out couch she didn't notice anymore, muttering about deadlines, clients, some big project that never seemed to end, her voice flat, rehearsed. Wait, coffee going cold in my hands, hoping for a spark of the old Sarah, the one who'd laugh at my terrible puns over a bottle of cheap red wine in our first apartment, who'd dance with me in the kitchen to scratchy radio tunes, barefoot, and grinning, her hair a mess of curls I'd tangle my fingers in. Instead, I got half-truths, vague shrugs and a gnawing dread I couldn't name, clawing at my chest like a trapped animal desperate to break free. I'd tried to chalk it up to stress, hers, mine, ours. She'd landed a promotion at her marketing firm a year back, a corner office with a view of the Chrysler building she'd gushed about for weeks, and I'd been proud, so damn proud, even if it meant more hours apart. I told myself it was temporary, that we'd find our rhythm again like we always had. Through the lean years when we ate ramen 3 nights a week, through the fights over bills and in-laws, through the miscarriage 5 years in that left us, both raw and quiet for months, we'd survived it all, hadn't we? But this was different. This wasn't exhaustion or distance. This was something colder, something deliberate. I'd catch her staring out the window sometimes, lost in thoughts she wouldn't share, her fingers tapping restlessly on her phone, and I'd wonder who she was texting, who was pulling her away from me. I'd ask, casual, light, not wanting, to push, and she'd snap, "It's just work, Ethan. God, can you stop hovering?" Her words stung, but I swallowed them like I always did, because fighting felt worse than silence. That evening, I decided I was done waiting, done pretending I didn't see what was right in front of me, done letting the dread fester until it consumed me whole. She walked in at 9:47 p.m. I know because I'd been glancing at the clock above. The stove like it was a lifeline, each tick a countdown to something I couldn't avoid any longer. No hello, no glance my way, just the rustle of her coat hitting the rack by the door, a navy wool thing I'd bought her for Christmas 3 years ago, followed by the click of her heels on the hardwood as she headed for the stairs. Her movements, mechanical, detached. I set my mug down, the clink echoing loud in the silence, sharper than I'd meant it to be, a sound that cut through the haze between us. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady but heavy, like it was carrying 15 years of unsaid weight I'd kept locked inside, a dam finally breaking. She froze mid-step on the third stair, her hand gripping the banister so tight her knuckles whitened, then turned to face me. Her green eyes were flat, unbothered, like I was a stranger asking for directions on a subway car, not the man she'd vowed to love forever, in a tiny chapel in Bed-Stuy, with 20 guests and a cake we'd made ourselves. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone neutral, clipped like we'd never shared a bed, a life, a promise sealed with rings we'd picked out together at a pawn shop on Flatbush Avenue. Hers, a thin gold band with a chip of emerald, mine scratched and worn from years of wear. I leaned forward, elbows pressing into the table, the wood cool against my skin, forcing the words out before they choked me, before I could talk myself out of it again, like I had a dozen times before. "I know you're cheating. And I think it's been going on for a while." No anger, no shouting, just the raw, painful truth I'd been dodging for too long, laid bare between us like a body on a slab, cold and still. Her eyes widened for a split second, a crack in her mask I almost missed, then a forced smile flickered across her lips. Not relief, not regret, but the kind of smirk you give when you're caught and don't care enough to hide it. A look I'd never seen on her before and wished I never had. "You're doing this again, Ethan?" She sighed, brushing it off like I was a kid throwing a tantrum over spilled milk, her voice light but edged with irritation. "You know how crazy work's been. Meetings, late nights. Can't you just deal with it? I'm exhausted. I don't need this right now." I shook my head, the disappointment leaking into my voice despite my best effort to keep it locked down, to keep it from breaking me right there. "It's not about accepting it, Sarah. It's the late nights you can't explain, the work trips that don't add up. 2 days in Chicago last month you never mentioned until you were packing. A weekend in Philly you said was a conference, but couldn't name when I asked. It's the way you look through me like I'm not even here, like I'm a ghost in my own goddamn house. I'm not stupid. I know you're lying." She didn't flinch, just stood there, arms crossed over her chest, her gaze tired but not guilty, not ashamed. Nothing I could grab onto, nothing I could fight. "Why can't you get it, Ethan?" she said, her voice rising now, sharp and defensive. "I have needs. For years you haven't been enough. Not physically, not emotionally. I needed something more, something you stopped giving me a long time ago." The words hit like a blade, cold and sharp, slicing through 15 years of trust, memories, promises, every late-night talk on the fire escape of our first place, every morning coffee I'd bring her in bed, every time I thought we were unbreakable, that we'd beat the odds. I clenched my jaw, fighting the heat rising in my chest, the sting behind my eyes I wouldn't let her see, wouldn't give her the satisfaction of knowing she could still hurt me this deep. "So I'm not good enough?" I said, my voice low, tight. "Just some broken machine that can't keep up with you. That's what I am after all this." She pursed her lips, hesitating, her eyes darting away for a moment before snapping back to me, harder now. "I'm not saying that," she shot back, her tone cutting sharper, a knife twisting in the wound. "But you don't get me anymore, Ethan. We're not the same. We haven't been for a long time. You're always at work, always quiet, always distant, locked in your head with your numbers. I needed more than that, more than this." She waved a hand around the kitchen at the life we'd built, like it was nothing, like it was trash. That hollowed me out. Not anger, but a cold, empty ache that settled deep in my bones, a void where love used to live. I stood, stepping closer, my boots heavy on the floor, my voice dropping low, steady, dangerous, each word deliberate. "I don't care what you do, Sarah. Cheat, live your life, chase whatever the hell you want. I don't give a damn anymore. But I won't take the lies. I won't be treated like I'm nothing, like I'm just a placeholder in your world while you fuck around behind my back." Her calm cracked then, a flicker of fear darting across her eyes, quick and sharp, like she'd finally realized the ground shifting under her feet, the weight of what she'd done catching up in a rush. "Can't you forgive me?" she asked, her voice small, almost fragile. A plea I hadn't heard from her in years, not since the early days when she'd cry over a fight and I'd pull her close, promising we'd figure it out. I looked at her, really looked at her, the woman I'd built my life around, the one I'd loved through every fight, every lean year, every quiet night, when we had nothing but each other to hold on to. Her curls were looser now, her face sharper, tired. But she was still Sarah, still the girl I'd met at a dive bar in Williamsburg, the one who'd spilled beer on me and laughed so hard she cried, the one I'd proposed to on a whim in Central Park with a ring I couldn't afford. My heart twisted, a pang of something old and familiar, but it didn't bend, didn't break. "No," I said, resolute, the word heavy as stone, final as a gunshot. "You've hurt me too much to just wipe it clean. You chose this, chose them, chose the lies over me, over us. Now I'm choosing too." She didn't move, just stared, tears welling in her eyes but not falling, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, the air between us thick with everything we couldn't take back. It wasn't just a fight, it was an end, a line drawn in, the sand between us deep and uncrossable, and we both knew it. The kitchen fell silent, the hum of the city outside the only sound, a distant roar that couldn't fill the void she'd carved out, couldn't drown the echo of her words still, ringing in my ears. The next morning I packed a bag. Not much, just a few changes of clothes stuffed into an old duffel, my laptop, a couple of dog-eared paperbacks I'd been meaning to reread. Steinbeck and Hemingway, books that felt like old friends, and left the brownstone without a word. She was still asleep, or pretending to be, curled under the quilt we'd bought on our 10th anniversary, a patchwork thing from a shop in the Catskills we'd stumbled into on a rare weekend away. Her breathing was soft in the grey dawn light, filtering through the curtains. Her hair spilled across the pillow, and I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. The curve of her shoulder, a memory I'd once traced with my fingers on lazy Sundays when we'd stay in bed until noon, talking about nothing and everything. I wanted to feel something, anger, sadness, love, but all I felt was tired, a bone-deep weariness that weighed me down. Then I shut the door, the click of the latch final, a sound that echoed in my chest, and walked out into the cold October air, the city waking up around me in a blur of horns and footsteps. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan, just knew I couldn't stay in that house, surrounded by ghosts of a life that didn't exist anymore. Every corner echoing with her laughter, her lies, the promises we'd made and broken. I checked into a cheap motel off the FDR Drive, the kind with thin walls where you could hear every cough and curse from the next room, every argument and late-night TV hum, and a buzzing neon sign outside that flickered red and blue through the blinds. Vacancy, it blinked over and over, keeping me up half the night. The bed sagged in the middle, the sheets scratchy and thin. The carpet smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarettes, but it was mine, a space where her shadow couldn't reach, where I didn't have to smell her lavender perfume lingering on the pillows or see her coat slung over the chair like she'd be back any minute. I lay there that first night, staring at the cracked ceiling, the hum of traffic outside a dull lullaby, and felt the weight of 15 years pressing down on me. Not regret, not yet, but an exhaustion I couldn't shake, a hollow ache that followed me into fitful sleep. Work became my anchor, the only thing keeping me from drifting into the dark, from losing myself completely. I threw myself into it. Long hours at the firm, late nights hunched over spreadsheets in my cubicle, numbers that didn't lie or betray or slip away in the night with someone else. My boss, Greg, a gruff guy with a beard like steel wool and a soft spot for strays, noticed the shift about a week in. "You okay, Harper?" he asked one afternoon, peering over his glasses as I handed him a report, my eyes red from lack of sleep, my hands shaky from too much coffee. I nodded, dodging the question with a shrug. "Just busy." And he let it drop, clapping me on the shoulder like he knew more than he'd say, like he'd seen guys like me before, running from something they couldn't name. The crew at the firm, Greg, Mia with her quick sarcasm and nicotine-stained fingers, Tom, who always had a bad joke and a worse tie, became my lifeline, tethering me to something real. Drinks after work at a dive bar in Hell's Kitchen, a place called Murphy's with sticky floors, dim lights, and a jukebox stuck on Springsteen and Stones, turned into a ritual, a lifeline I clung to. They'd share stories about their own messes, divorces, bad dates, fights with landlords, the time Mia's ex keyed her car, and I'd listen sipping a beer, the laughter drowning out the quiet that followed me everywhere, the silence that had become my shadow. I didn't tell them about Sarah, not yet, not the whole ugly truth, just said I'd moved out, needed a change, and they didn't push. They just kept me moving, kept me from sinking into the void she'd left behind. Weeks bled into months. Each day a small step away from the wreckage, a slow crawl out of the hole I'd fallen into. I found a small apartment in Queens, cramped with a single window that looked out on a brick wall covered in peeling paint, and a radiator that clanked and hissed like it was dying every time it kicked on, but it was a start, a foothold. I signed the lease with cash from my savings, hauled in a mattress I bought off Craigslist, and a folding chair from a bodega down the street, and called it home. The first night, I sat on the floor with a takeout pizza from a joint around the E corner, grease soaking through the box, the silence deafening without her voice, her footsteps, her presence filling the space like it used to. I could still hear her in my head, laughing at a dumb joke I'd made, humming off-key while she cooked, whispering my name in the dark, and it hurt, a sharp pang I didn't expect. But it was mine, this empty little room, and that was enough to keep me going. I started running again, something I'd dropped years ago when Sarah complained it took too much time away from her, from us, back when I'd bend over backwards to keep her happy. I'd lace up my sneakers at dawn, hit the streets before the city fully woke, the rhythm of my feet on pavement and the burn in my lungs, a freedom I hadn't felt since I was 20, back when life was simpler, when love didn't come with a price tag, when I didn't know what it felt like to be gutted. The cold air stung my face, sweat soaked through my hoodie, my breath fogging in the chill, and with every mile, I shed a little more of the man she'd left behind, the one who'd wait silently, coffee in hand, while she lived a double life I was too blind, too trusting to see. I'd run along the East River, the skyline sharp against the sky, the water glinting in the early light, and feel the weight lifting, piece by piece. I wasn't him anymore, and the realization hit me one morning as I stopped by the riverbank, hands on my knees, chest heaving. I was surviving. Maybe even living, clawing my way back to something that felt like me. Friends noticed the change, couldn't help but see it. Mia cornered me one night at Murphy's, her beer halfway to her lips, eyes narrowed like she was sizing me up. "You're different, Ethan. Lighter somehow. What's up?" I shrugged, gave her a half smile and said, "Just running off some steam." She didn't buy it. Mia never did. But she didn't pry, just clinked her bottle against mine and let it go. With a smirk. Greg started throwing more work my way. Bigger accounts, tighter deadlines, clients who didn't mess around. And I took it all, grateful for the distraction, the purpose, the chance to prove I wasn't broken. I wasn't just the quiet guy, in the corner anymore, the one who'd nod and keep his head down. I was the one they relied on, the one who got shit done, who'd stay late to double-check figures, who'd take the calls no one else wanted. It wasn't much, but it was something, a lifeline I could hold on to. Then she called. 4 months after I'd walked out, my phone buzzed on the counter while I was cooking, a rare night in with a beer and a half-decent attempt at spaghetti, the kitchen filling with the smell of garlic and tomatoes, a faint comfort in the chaos. Her name lit up the screen, Sarah, and I froze, fork halfway to my mouth, the sound of the pot bubbling behind me, the only noise in the room. I almost let it ring out, let it fade into the void like so much else I'd left behind. But something, curiosity, maybe, or a masochistic need to hear her voice to see if it still cut, made me pick up, my thumb hovering over the button before I pressed it. "Ethan," she said, her voice shaky, not the confident, cutting Sarah I'd known for half my life, the one who could talk her way out of anything. I know I messed up. I'm so sorry. I just want to talk." I leaned against the counter, the pasta simmering behind me, steam rising in lazy curls, and stayed silent, letting her fill the space, letting her dig her own hole. She kept going, words tumbling out like she'd rehearsed them in front of a mirror. "I love you." I was Wrong about everything? I was selfish, stupid, caught up in something I didn't even want, not really. Can we just try again? Please? I miss you. I closed my eyes. The ache still there, but duller now. A bruise fading under the skin, not the raw wound it had been. No, Sarah, I said, my voice low, steady, each word a brick in a wall. I was building between us. You don't get to say that after what you did. I can't live with someone who'd rather lie than fight for us, who'd rather run to someone else than talk to me, than tell me we were falling apart. Please, she whispered, tears choking her words, a sound I'd once have moved. Mountains to stop, once have sold my soul to fix. I'll do anything, Ethan, I swear, I'll change, I'll quit the job, It's too late. My tone was firm, final, a door slamming shut with a clang that echoed in my chest. I'm done. She didn't argue, just sobbed quietly, a soft, broken sound that echoed through the line, tugging at something deep inside me. Memory, maybe, or guilt, but not enough to pull me back. I hung up, my finger steady on the button, and stood there, staring at the phone, the pasta bubbling over behind me, sauce spilling onto the stove with a faint hiss. I didn't feel triumph, didn't feel vindication, just a strange peace, like I'd finally cut the last thread tying me to her. A thread I hadn't even known was still there, frayed and thin but stubborn as hell. A year later I was different, not just surviving but building something new, something that felt like mine. The apartment in Queens wasn't just a crash pad anymore. I'd hung a few prints on the walls, black and white shots of the city I'd picked up at a flea market in Long Island City. Bought a decent couch that didn't sag in the middle, a coffee table I'd sanded and stained myself in a rare burst of energy. I'd made it a home instead of a hideout, a place where I could breathe, where the silence wasn't suffocating but freeing. Work was good, better than good. Greg had pushed me for a promotion after I'd closed a big account with a law firm downtown, and I'd taken it, leading a small team now, barking orders with a confidence I didn't know I had, a voice I'd buried under years of quiet compromise. I'd started dating again, nothing serious, just coffee with a woman from the gym who liked to talk about books, a dinner with a friend of Mia's who laughed too loud but had kind eyes. But it was a step, a crack in the wall I'd built around myself, letting light seep in. Then I met Claire. She was a bartender at Murphy's, all sharp edges and quick laughs. With dark hair she tied back in a messy bun that always seemed one tug away from falling loose, strands escaping to frame her face. We'd talked for months, casual stuff over. The bar, sports. She was a die-hard Knicks fan, I stuck to baseball. Music, she loved punk, I leaned toward classic rock. The time she'd punched a guy in the nose for grabbing her ass during a busy shift and laughed about it after. She'd slide me a beer with a smirk, call me numbers because of my job, and I'd fire back with some dumb quip that made her roll her eyes. I liked her ease, her honesty, the way she didn't tiptoe around me. And one night, after a few too many beers and a rare burst of courage, I asked her out. She said yes with a grin, wiping her hands on a rag, and it was easy. No games, no lies, just two people sharing beers and burgers at a greasy spoon down the street from Murphy's, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and fries that tasted like heaven. She told me about her ex over that first meal, a guy who'd cheated with her best friend, left her picking up the pieces of a life she'd thought was solid. And I opened up about Sarah, the kitchen, the lies, the way she'd gutted me without a second thought. Sounds like you dodged a bullet, she said, her hazel eyes steady on mine, no pity, just truth, a quiet strength I hadn't realized I needed to hear. I nodded, the weight of it settling in my chest like a stone finally, sinking to the bottom of a river, and realized she was right. I had dodged it even if it took me too long to see it. Claire didn't fix me. I'd done that myself, piece by piece, day by day. But she fit into the life I was building, slotting in like a puzzle piece I hadn't known was missing, until it clicked into place. We took it slow, no rush, just two. People figuring it out over late-night talks at her place after her shifts, lazy mornings when she'd crash at mine with coffee and bagels from the deli downstairs. One night, months in, we were sprawled on my couch, a movie flickering on the TV, some action flick neither of us cared about, just background noise, and she rested her head on my shoulder, her hair tickling my neck, her breathing soft against me. I felt something settle, contentment maybe, or hope, a warmth I hadn't felt in years, not since the early days with Sarah when everything was new and unbroken, when love felt like a promise instead of a trap. Life kept moving and I moved with it, finding a rhythm I could live in. 2 years after that kitchen showdown, I'd carved out something solid. Work was steady. The team I led had doubled in size, taking on bigger clients, more responsibility, my name on memos and emails that mattered. Claire and I were talking about getting a place together, maybe something with a view that wasn't just a brick wall, a step towards something permanent, but not rushed. I'd stopped running to escape and started doing it for the thrill, a way my pulse pounded in my ears, the city blurring past me as I pushed harder, faster, stronger. Murphy's was still a second home, a constant in the chaos. Friday nights with the crew, Greg nursing a whiskey, Mia chain-smoking outside, Tom telling stories about his latest dating disasters, Claire behind the bar some shifts, winking at me over the taps when she caught me staring. Sarah faded into the background, a memory I rarely touched, a scar that didn't hurt anymore unless I pressed on it. I'd heard through an old mutual friend, some guy we'd known in Brooklyn named Paul, a loudmouth who always had gossip, that she'd moved upstate after losing the brownstone to foreclosure, taken a job waiting tables at a diner off the highway, was trying to piece herself back together after everything fell apart. I didn't care, didn't feel the old sting when her name came up, didn't wonder about her the way I used to. She was a chapter I'd closed, a book I'd put down and left on the shelf to gather dust, its pages yellowing with time. Then she showed up again. I was at the firm, wrapping up a late meeting about a new client, a tech startup with deep pockets, and a tight deadline, papers scattered across the conference table, coffee cups littering the room when Mia poked her head in, her brow furrowed, a cigarette still tucked behind her ear. "Some woman's here for you, Ethan. Says it's urgent. Won't leave until she sees you." I knew it was her before I even stood up. Knew it in my gut. The way you know a storm's coming before the sky turns black. A prickle down my spine I couldn't shake. She stood in the lobby, thinner than I remembered, her frame swallowed by a coat too big for her, a faded grey thing that hung off her shoulders like a shroud. Her hair was chopped short, streaked with grey she hadn't bothered to dye, her face lined with something like regret, exhaustion, defeat. Dark circles under her eyes, a tremble in her hands as she clutched a purse that looked like it had been patched one too many times. "Ethan," she started, her voice trembling, cracking on the edges like glass about to shatter. "I need to see you. I've lost everything. The job, the house, my savings. I'm alone now, completely alone." I crossed my arms, leaning against the reception desk, the old anger a faint echo, a whisper I could barely hear over the hum of the office. Phones ringing, keyboards clacking, life moving on around us. "What do you want from me, Sarah?" I asked, my voice flat, steady, giving her nothing to grab onto. "I'm sorry," she said, her eyes darting to the floor, then back to me, wet with tears she didn't let fall, her lip quivering. "I was stupid, selfish, I know that now. I hurt you and I hate myself for it, hate what I did to us. Can you help me, just a little? For old time's sake? I don't have anyone else." I stared at her, the woman I'd loved for half my life, the one I'd built dreams with, fought for, cried over, now a stranger begging for scraps of a life she'd thrown away with both hands. Her words hung there, heavy, desperate, a plea. That echoed back to the kitchen, to every lie she'd fed me. Every night I'd waited while she was with someone else. They didn't touch me, didn't stir the pity she was fishing for, didn't move the wall I'd built, brick by brick. "No," I said, calm but cold, each syllable deliberate, sharp as a blade. "You made your choices. Every late night, every lie, every time you walked out that door for someone else, every time you chose them over me. I made mine too. I've got nothing left for you, Sarah. Not a dime, not a word." Her eyes filled, with tears spilling over now, streaking down her cheeks, her lip quivering as she stepped closer, hands reaching out like she could pull me back, like she could rewind time. "Ethan, please, I don't have anyone else. I know I don't deserve it. I know I fucked up everything, but I'm drowning here. Go." I cut her off, turning away, my boots loud on the tile as I walked back to my office, leaving her standing there. Her sobs followed me, soft and broken, a sound that might have broken me once but now just faded into the background, swallowed by the hum of the office. The crew watched from their desks, Mia's eyes wide with surprise, Greg's jaw tight with something like approval, Tom pretending to shuffle papers but sneaking glances. As I shut the door, the click of the latch, a wall between me and her, a line I wouldn't cross again. That night, Claire and I sat on my tiny balcony, the city humming below us, a sea of light stretching out to the horizon, bright and restless. I told her about Sarah, every word of it, from the kitchen 2 years ago to the lobby that afternoon, the way she'd stood there like a ghost of someone I used to know, begging for a piece of me I wouldn't give. Claire listened, her hand resting on mine, her thumb tracing small circles on my skin, grounding me in the moment, keeping me from drifting back to that dark place. "You okay?" she asked when I finished, her voice soft but steady, her hazel eyes searching mine, warm in the dim glow of the string lights we'd hung up weeks ago. "Yeah," I said, squeezing her hand, feeling the warmth of her against the cool night air, the solidness of her beside me. "Better than okay." She smiled, leaning into me, her head settling on my shoulder, her hair brushing my cheek, and I looked out at the skyline, bright, loud, alive, a chaos I'd learned to navigate, a city that didn't stop for anyone. Sarah had taken everything she could, my trust, my years, my peace, ripped it apart with her lies and her needs, left me bleeding in that kitchen 2 years ago, a shell of the man I'd been. But I'd taken it back piece by piece, built something stronger from the ashes she'd left behind, something she couldn't touch, couldn't break. The job, the apartment, Claire, the man I'd become, it was all mine, earned with sweat, and silence, and a stubborn refusal to break, to let her win. I wasn't the quiet guy in the kitchen anymore, waiting for a lie to unravel, hoping for a love that didn't exist, that never really had, not the way I'd thought. I was Ethan, free, strong, whole, a man who'd walked through the fire and come out the other side, scarred but standing. And that was worth more than she'd ever know, more than she'd ever understand, more than she'd ever deserved to take from me. Months rolled into a year, and life settled into a rhythm I could feel in my bones, a beat I'd made my own. Claire and I moved into a place together, a small loft in Astoria, with a sliver of a river view through a narrow window, walls we painted a deep blue, because she said it reminded her of the ocean she'd grown up near in Maine, a color that felt like calm after years of storm. We'd cooked together in the cramped kitchen, her teasing me about my terrible knife skills. "You're gonna lose a finger, Numbers." Me laughing when she burned the garlic bread and set off the smoke alarm, the two of us waving towels at it like kids. Work kept growing. My team at the firm hit 12 people, accounts piling up, my name on the door now next to Greg's in black letters that still felt surreal when I saw them. I'd run in the mornings along the river, Claire, sometimes joining me, her pace faster than mine, her grin daring me to keep up, her laughter echoing over the water when I'd trip over a crack in the sidewalk. We'd furnished the loft slowly, piece by piece, no rush. A thrift store table we refinished together, a rug she'd haggled for at a market in Brooklyn, a bookshelf I'd built from scratch with wood from a hardware store down the street, my hands blistered but proud when it stood steady. We'd sit out on the fire escape some nights, not a balcony but close enough, legs dangling, beers in hand, watching the city pulse below us, talking about nothing and everything. She'd tell me about her childhood, summers on the coast, her dad teaching her to fish, her mom's terrible cooking, and I'd share mine growing up in Jersey, my older brother who'd moved to California, the way I'd fallen into numbers because they made sense when nothing else did. It was simple, messy, real, and I felt it. A peace I'd fought for, a life I'd built from the ground up, brick by brick, nail by nail. Sarah faded into the background, a memory I rarely touched, a scar that didn't hurt anymore unless I pressed on it hard, and even then, it was just a dull ache, a ghost of pain. I'd heard through Paul, that loudmouth from Brooklyn, that she'd moved upstate after losing the brownstone to foreclosure, couldn't keep up with the mortgage after her firm downsized and cut her loose, taken a job waiting tables at a diner off I-87, A place with cracked vinyl seats and coffee that tasted like burnt rubber, according to him. He'd seen her there once, passing through on a road trip. Said she looked tired, older, like life had wrung her out and hung her up to dry. I didn't care. Didn't feel the old sting when her name came up. Didn't wonder about her the way I used to. Didn't picture her in that diner. Didn't imagine her alone. She was a chapter I'd closed, a book I'd put down and left on the shelf to gather dust, its pages yellowing with time, its story one I didn't need to reread. One night, after a long day at the firm, meetings that dragged, numbers that wouldn't balance until I forced them to, I came home to Claire in the kitchen, chopping onions with a focus that made me smile, her hair tied back with a bandana, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. "For you're late," she said, not looking up, her voice teasing, a playful edge I'd come to love. "Dinner's almost ready. Don't expect me to save you any if you keep dawdling." "Smells better than my spaghetti," I shot back, dropping my bag by the door and crossing to her, the day's weight slipping off my shoulders with every step. She laughed, swatting me with a dish towel, and I pulled her into a hug, her warmth seeping into me, chasing out the chill of the day, the city's noise fading to a hum outside. We ate at the tiny table by the window, the river glinting outside, under the streetlights, and talked about her shift at Murphy's, my latest client who couldn't stop changing his mind. The dog we were thinking of adopting from a shelter in Queens, a scruffy mutt with one ear flopped over that she'd fallen. For the second she saw it. It was simple, messy, real. A life stitched together from the scraps of what I'd lost, stronger for it. Sarah crossed my mind for a fleeting second. Her tears in the lobby, her pleas, the wreckage she'd left behind, and I let it drift. Away, carried off by the hum of the city outside, the sound of Claire's voice pulling me back. She'd thought I'd stay broken, thought I'd never climb out of the hole she'd dug with her lies, her betrayal. She was wrong, wrong about me, wrong about us, wrong about everything that mattered. Claire reached across the table, her hand finding mine, her fingers rough from years behind the bar but warm, steady. I squeezed it, grounding myself in the moment, in her, in this loft with its creaky floors, this life with its quiet joys, this me I'd fought to become. Sarah was gone, not just from my days but from my bones, and what I had now was mine, mine alone, mine with Claire, mine in a way it never had been with her.